speaker today is an assistant professor at the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources. She's a fellow of the Gunn Institute of Environment and an associate director of the Institute of Environmental Diplomacy and Security at the University of Vermont. She also works on the board of the Vermont Natural Resources Council, Community Action Works, and the BPOC board of Renew Vermont. She is the research core lead at the Rural Environment Justice Opportunities Informed by Community Expertise Coalition. It's a mouthful, Bindu. Bindu works at the intersection of environmental health, science, technology, and society studies and environmental justice. Today, she will be talking about her environmental justice work here in Vermont. And Bindu, I want to say we really appreciate you taking the time to share with us. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. So it's a little bit weird doing this webinar because I do not know who's actually listening to me. I really cannot see anyone. But anyway, thank you for joining this webinar. I'm really happy to share the research that I've been working on for the past couple of years, to be exact, since 2018. This project started in 2017 when the Department of Environmental Conservation got in touch with some of the partners that you see on the screen here, namely, especially the Vermont Law School and the Toxics Action Center. They got in touch to get some help on building an environmental justice focus within each of the programs that DEC has. And DEC wanted to do that because as part of the performance agreement plan that they have with the EPA, they need to build an EJ within all of the programs that DEC has. So I got involved at that early stage because some of these groups that you see here got in touch with me, and so we've been having ongoing conversations with DEC and since then some other state departments about environmental justice issues in Vermont. So a little bit about the Rejoice, the partnership, like Juliana said, it's quite a mouthful, so we'll keep it short as Rejoice. So it's a partnership that came together to explore and examine environmental justice issues in Vermont, and we've been partnering with a lot of state and non-governmental organizations, also universities. So as a group, we have a community core, groups like Community Action Works and Center for Whole Communities kind of form the community core, and UVM has taken on the research lead, and policy core is largely run by the Vermont Law School and the Environmental EJ Clinic with Marianne Engelman-Lado as the lead there. Some of the key focus within the group has also been to make sure that any environmental justice policy making that happens is truly informed by, from the ground up, that it's informed by the local communities. So that's a little bit of background on Rejoice. So in this particular talk, I am going to talk a little bit about environmental justice, but what does environmental justice mean for Vermonters? How do we understand environmental justice in the state of Vermont? So there are multiple definitions of environmental justice. The EPA has its own definition, which is which they term it as a fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, and national origin, income, and with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So when we were doing some of our community outreach and local events, we got in touch with some of the community groups and to talk about environmental justice. And we put this definition out there, and they were completely baffled by it. They were like, what does it mean? It doesn't say much. So this has been an ongoing concern that we've had, because people define environmental justice in very different ways. And this is also something that we wanted to really focus on and understand, what is environmental justice? This is a word cloud on, some of the key issues that have come up from some of the focus groups that my community partners have done. So you cannot, there are multiple issues that are so entangled when you think about environmental justice, community issues, social issues, all of those really kind of stand out. In terms of environmental justice, especially notions of justice has been theorized for a long time, since the 70s, starting with the work of John Rawls. But there are three main components that have been theorized and talked about quite a bit, especially the distributive justice, procedural justice, and recognition justice. Distributive justice, making sure that the public goods and bads are equally distributed, that no one is unfairly bearing a higher burden than others. So no discrimination based on the distribution of impacts, responsibilities, and spatial composition of benefits versus risks. And also this idea of distributive justice has also touched on issues of understanding or building local capabilities and values, drawing from the work of Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. But distributive justice also, focuses on making sure that there are clean access to air, water, healthy living spaces, healthcare, etc., and focuses on good quality of life. Participatory procedural justice, on the other hand, is focused largely on the decision making. So focuses quite a bit on public participation, as Rejoice focuses on, and also access to information, language access. These are all important things that are routinely or most commonly addressed within procedural justice. And there are many different forms of participation, and that is probably a conversation on its own. Maybe I will not touch on it since we don't have that much time. And in terms of recognition justice, you can read, it's about making sure that we are recognizing the positionalities of the people that are on positionalities of people who are unfairly unburdened. So to some extent, it's recognizing the needs, the shared values of specific groups, and responding appropriately, or also looking into process of disrespect, insult, or degradation that devalues, some people's land or resources versus others. So it also looks into the ways affected people themselves perceive and judge the legitimacy of intervention. So it is also, to some extent, instilling a sense of justice that is informed by the affected community and focusing on more inclusive practices and inclusive placemaking options within addressing environmental justice issues. But this said, not all environmental justice projects really focus on all these notions of justice. Some projects probably only address distributive justice. Some most address maybe distributive and procedural. And especially in indigenous movements have definitely been addressing recognition, justice, for a long time now. So now that was a background. I just wanted to now go into, the work itself. How do we define environmental justice in Vermont? What are the justice issues that are most discussed and debated in Vermont? In exploring this, I'll also talk about the processes or methodologies I've used to understand what is environmental justice in Vermont. So one way of doing environmental justice, is to start with a first generation approach, which is to look into, blaring sites that are contributing to a lot of pollution and the communities around it. So this has been the focus since the 1980s. There have been a lot of environmental justice movement that have started as a result of, citing really landfill sites in really poor neighborhoods. So this kind of an approach looks at the simple local proximities to a really big polluting source. It also acts as galvanizes political activism. And it's largely self-mobilized by community members. So there are some examples of this we can see in Vermont. The most recent one is that of the PFAS contamination in Bennington. So you can actually see some of the backyard gardens of some of the residents who live close to the Bennington site, the Saint-Gobain factory site. And then on the other side, you can actually see a picture of a mobile home park. How do people living at large in Bennington experience, the contamination of PFAS? Do they, experience it and address it the same way? So these are some of the things that we've also kind of looked into, especially in mobile home parks. They've had a lot of issues with concerns with water quality and people having had to drink bottled water because some of them are still on the well, but a lot of them are on public water supply system. So this is an example of, a look, much more of a broader look into some of the key concerns, environmental justice concerns that are standing out. And we all know about the work that Migrant Justice has done, looking into or highlighting the unique concerns that dairy farm workers are experiencing in Vermont. But also not addressed is the intensive practices, industrial practices that are used in the big dairy industries in Vermont. Another issue that came up is the big landfill site in Coventry. Few people have also raised issues of renewable energy siting, like the wind energy in Northeast Kingdom as well. But there are multiple ways of also exploring, environmental justice. This is a project that's I'm not completely sure who is doing it, but this just came to me. There's a talk that's being given on the Inequality Project, which is coming up in the next month. But even within this mapping, you can see Vermont is largely blank. It looks like there are no inequalities in Vermont. So that's just the general perception that Vermont is this beautiful, picturesque place with rolling hills, and everyone's environmental, and probably not as many environmental justice issues. So that is a mapping approach, but there are other ways of understanding multi-dimensional approaches that we can use to understand how environmental justice is reproduced in the state. Which is examining the spatial relations and flows, and to understand well-being, vulnerability, and its connection with the environment. So this is kind of showing the mapping, a spatial analysis project that we ourselves did, combining demographic variables, environmental metrics, and health variables. So this is a much more sophisticated rendering of the spatial analysis. This work is actually done by my graduate student, Cheng Ren. It demonstrates another way of learning environmental justice issues, which is perusing through the existing databases and mapping it to identify where are the hotspots, what are some of the key environmental issues in the state. And so this map gives you an idea of the key hotspots. She also, Ching also did some probabilistic association, and this, what looks like a complicated set of graphs, is showing that minority population had a relatively a higher experience of average, or were impacted more by environmental exposure. Also, this relationship was also seen among people with limited English proficiency. But interestingly, there was no association between poverty and environmental exposure, and also no association between SNAP members and environmental exposure. So this is based on the existing databases. There are many holes within the existing databases, but it gives us basic evidence that there are inequities within the state that we need to really pay attention to and look a little bit more closely into. So that's exactly what we did. What we did is we kind of zoomed into those hotspot communities, and we did a door-to-door survey, largely in neighborhoods that have high environmental burdens, or are low-income communities, or are communities of color. So a big survey of 58 questions. It was mostly done in 2019, and we got about 571 responses. And these are some of the questions asked. So we did not include questions only on the environmental burdens, but also on the environmental benefits. This is just a quick summary of the results. I don't know if I have time to go through all of it. But basically, it shows that majority of the population that we talk to are 31% of them live below, $25,750, which is the federal, poverty cutoff, and about 54% of them were renters, and also about 15% of the population that we talked to were identified themselves as people of color. But if we break this data base by demographics, we can actually see that majority of the non-white population, most of the people below the poverty line were people of color, and also about those with an income above the poverty line, male male participants had the highest income above the poverty line, and non-white had the lowest in that category. And you can also see that majority of the non-white were renters. Some of the key significant observations are, which is not surprising, that white respondents were 3 times more likely to be homeowners than those who identified as non-white, and those living below the poverty line were 8 times more likely to be renters. So that's not the major kind of findings, but that's just the beginning. But I wanted to put this slide out because I just wanted to show that not everyone was equally concerned about environmental issues, as you see here, social issues. But again, there are some things within the environmental issues that really stands out. One is water quality. A lot of the people, 40% of the, 40% of the people we close to, we talked to, were concerned about that. And this again does a cross-sectional analysis of environmental concern by gender, race, income, and homeownership. And what we identified is that BIPOC or non-white participants were twice as likely to report mold, lack of access to public transportation, to not own a vehicle, have trouble paying for food, not having primary care doctors, report more autoimmune disorders. So you can actually see a trend here. And then there were 3 times more likely to rely on public transportation, had trouble paying for electricity, and go hungry in a month. So again, the key thing I want to highlight is that the predominance of social concerns within the environmental justice issues that we're looking into. And this just shows the distribution of, health concerns that some of the people have actually noted. And this was especially significant among those living below the poverty line, had especially lower access to fresh produce, and reported more asthma and cardiovascular disease and cancer. So, and then while we were finishing all of this work, COVID hit, and then we had to change our strategy of doing our research. And so we moved all of our work online and did a series of focus group sessions with funding from the GUND Rapid grants that was issued in the summer. So we engaged community leaders, did Zoom sessions, compensated the partners, and we also got some external funding, especially from the Department of Health, to do some of this work. And these are the communities that we've actually talked to: Bhutanese, Nepali elders, deaf and hard of hearing community, migrant farm workers, mobile home communities, people with disability, rural communities, seniors, and Somali Bantu elders and parents, really targeting the most vulnerable communities in Vermont. So these are some of the findings from the focus group in particular. Again, one key thing that I wanted to highlight is that some communities are not very good in bringing up environmental issues, and had less environmental concerns, maybe due to the issues around the language, or even translation of issues around environmental justice. But otherwise, you can see water quality issues was a major thing that keeps coming up, water and sewage issues. And, especially in mobile home communities, some of the low income neighborhoods, this is a recurring trend. Also with COVID, some concerns were kids not feeling comfortable playing outside because they're afraid that neighbors will call the cops on them. And this is something that have come up in multiple places. Access to food has been raised. I mean, there's general access to food, but not, often healthy, desirable, or fresh food. Housing and transportation issue is another key thing. But also an important thing to talk about is that of language access. This is a key concern to focus on because of its relevance to procedural justice issues, and also language access and communication is important for building community resilience and to avoid any future health and environmental emergencies. So it basically explored how well the state is actually doing in addressing emergencies. And basically at generally lack of easily accessible language specific information, and in-person support is still needed quite a bit. When we talked to ALV especially, they were spending a lot of time helping their clients who could not, who did not have access to interpreters. But one of the key things that came up is also that if you don't have internet access, you can't access the government. If you don't really know how to go about using the internet to access some of this information, then you're really at a disadvantage. And then you rely on other sources of information, and cases of misinformation was also talked about a little bit. Some also talked about information channels being cut off with their doctors. And also, again, how do you navigate issues of safety, isolation, despair, hardship in these times? and also to resolve some of these issues and the disputes that result from living in these times where, you know, many people have lost their jobs. They have to apply for, you know, they have to apply for, what's the word I'm looking for? Unemployment. So, and many people don't know how to do it and need help. So it is an important service that the state needs. But again, I just want to come back to the question of how do we define environmental justice. What I wanted to do was go through all of the things that we have done and to also look into what are the most prominent issues that people have actually addressed. And while doing our work, we also did about, you know, over 50 interviews across the state. And one of the key things that we asked people were, you know, what is environmental justice? And so I just wanted to kind of put together like a set of different definitions that people have actually, you know, said. And one is intersection of political power, poverty, and pollution. Framing the conversation around what affects my life could help understand the issues at stake. Cost and quality of housing, access to transportation, access to land, community garden spaces. These were defined as environmental justice issues to one of the community member that we talked to. One member said environmental justice is humans being nice to the environment. If you use the term economic justice instead, that people listen to that. Conservatives listen to that agreement, but it's not really that different. It's not at all, because that environment is our economy. Another definition is environment that a specific individual is dealing with on a daily basis in both their home, their work environment, and their relaxation environment, which kind of closely aligns with the definition of environment. Environment is where you eat, work, play, and such. So giving everyone the same opportunity and the same conditions to thrive. Environmental justice is social justice. This was another definition. What people mean when they say we have to save the earth, what they really mean is that we have to save human civilization and perhaps some other species with us. So in short, you know, EJ is you know, about expansion and connection and change. It's about components of power and powerlessness. And EJ is always already at the crossroads. And rather than, you know, fixing a meaning in time or space, it's a process of politics, of meaning making. And that is what makes EJ continually relevant. As part of our research, we also have taken a historical approach looking into, I've always been concerned and wondered why Vermont is so white. It really makes no sense. It's such a progressive state. It's beautiful. It's in New England. Every other parts, New York and Massachusetts are definitely more diverse. So how come Vermont is so white? So what are the practices and policies that keep Vermont so white? Does it land use policies and zoning laws reinforce whiteness? Does the branding of Vermont deliberately keep some people out? Real estate industry contribute to dominant whiteness, land trust and land speculation consolidate white ownership. And also, why do people of color feel like they do not belong in Vermont? So these are ongoing interviews, and this historical approach actually takes a different approach than a distributive justice approach or just a procedural justice approach, but digs deeper into the policy related issues. And this is actually one of my other graduate students is looking into, Eloise is looking into imaginaries of land reparation sovereignty in the US, and so on. So in short, I am a little bit over time, but this is the last slide. Environmental and health disparities are very prominent in BIPOC and low-income population in Vermont. Social justice concern are, definitely stand out than ecological justice in EJ framings in Vermont. Translation of environmental justice is something that has come up multiple times, where the key problem is when environmental justice is such a history and has a complex theoretical framing, like distributive justice and procedural justice, it's not easy to translate it to some of the people. Especially if they are not from this country, and you cannot, if there is no concept of environmental justice framed in other languages, then it's harder to translate. And also from talking to many of the people across the state, there was always a tension between, but that's not environmental justice, that's social justice. And this is something that you heard quite a bit. The other issue is that of organizing. Most of the environmental organizations in Vermont are white, with white administration. And there are some exceptions, and we need more of those to take a leading role in identifying, framing EJ issues, EJ organizing and policy making. So we can draft environmental justice policies framed by affected communities. So that's it.